Now, a recent report by the Red Cross revealed that over 100 million people in Africa are facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity. The COVID-19 pandemic has been the predominant driver of that food insecurity. It also exposed the cracks in Africa's food systems, already under strain from climate change, conflict and pests. However, the experts also say that we are still seeing evidence of agricultural transformation on the continent. The Africa Development Bank says it believes increased investments and expanded partnerships are urgently needed to promote Africa's agricultural transformation through technology and innovation. Well, today, the organization kicked off a high-level dialogue on the issue, inviting heads of state, multilateral development banks, development partners, and private sector operators, amongst others, to discuss just that. Well, let's take that all apart with Martin Fregene. He's the Director of Agriculture and Agro-Industry at the African Development Bank. Great to have you with us today, Mr. Fregene. Now, of course, when we discuss scaling up successful innovations in agriculture on the continent, working with both the public and private sector, is the focus just on technology alone, or are we looking at a much wider pool of practices? What is the vision in terms of implementing large-scale adoption in agriculture going forward?
Thank you very much, Uche, for having me. And when we talk of innovations, of course, the most obvious things are things like improved seeds that we know have increased productivity by up to 10 times, for example, in maize, or increased productivity. That's when you compare those who use the best technologies and who don't use it, up to 10 times in maize, or maybe 8 times in wheat, and it goes on. And so that's one innovation that is obvious. Another innovation that is obvious is, of course, mechanization. One tractor can probably do the work of 100 men in a single day. But there are other innovations, and these are the ones that we're also looking at. One very obvious one is big data. For a minute, think about the speed and the quantity of data that is being generated and processed every day. For example, Facebook generates 5 petabytes. That is 5 million gigabytes of data every day. And that data is being processed, and people are finding patterns and using that to predict and not to solve problems. For example, in agriculture, big data is now being used to model the weather. So you can know exactly, you can predict the rains, and farmers can be told when to plant or when not to plant. Big data is also being used on agricultural insurance, to help farmers, against the vagaries of climate change, against the unknowns of climate. Big data is also being used for agricultural risk indexing to help financial institutions assess how much risk is involved. It's also used for predicting pests and diseases. For example, we have the early warning wheat rust, a major problem of wheat all around the world. It's now a big data, artificial intelligence-driven prediction of wheat, early prediction of wheat rust. So you see that big data is actually becoming more and more a very important tool, as important as seeds or as mechanization or as inputs like a fertilizer. So this is one thing that the bank is also working very hard on. Another thing is innovation in digital agriculture. Digital agriculture goes from platforms like ICT-based platforms. One good example is Amazon in the US, but there are little Amazons all around Africa that try to bring buyer and seller of inputs, buyer and seller of produce together without even meeting each other. Transactions are done also, payment is made all online. So we at the African Development Bank are trying to scale all those innovations, seeds, fertilizer, mechanization, big data for weather prediction, ICT-based platforms for better output and input markets. Thank you.
Well, let's talk a bit about that, because actually what you're discussing is how can we scale up these innovations that you just spoke of in order to boost Africa's agricultural sector. So give us a sense of the factors that will be critical to scaling up as we go forward.
Okay, there are 3 major factors. The first one is the technology itself. You must find a provider, a reliable provider who is able to demonstrate the technology so that you can create a demand. And also, a reliable provider that is also able to scale the technology so that it can reach many people. That's the first thing. The second thing is the policy environment. You must be able to have policies, if it's ICT, you're looking at, you must have a regulatory policy environment, for proper ICT. If it seeds the same thing, you must have laws that penalize sale of grain as seed. So the policy environment is very, very important. The third thing, and also perhaps the most important, is political will. The organizations that scale up are either governments or the private sector. And for many technologies, it's always government that actually, is a what I call the risk taker. They come in and begin the process, and then later on, the private sector comes on board. So those three things I just mentioned, the technology provider, the policy environment, and government, they are very key for scaling up. That is why today we brought together heads of states to make the political commitments. We brought together technology providers. We also brought together, experts, in the field of policy to see how Africa can scale the best technologies and make sure that farmers get a good return for their investments.
Now, I'm curious, of course, are there any success stories on the continent in terms of scaling up these large projects or large-scale scaling up and, of course, investing in these projects, partnerships as well between the public and private sector? Give us an example of this.
Yeah, Uche, I'll give you three very quickly. The first one is Sudan. Sudan is a big wheat-consuming country, but it's also a dry country. Even though you have, the Nile flowing through that country, but it's dry. So the wheat season, which is about now, is always, very hot. And wheat doesn't do very well. The traditional wheat varieties don't do well. So we scale heat-tolerant wheat varieties, working with seed companies and working with many, other partners, like government. Were able to produce 65,000 tons of heat-tolerant wheat, seeds of heat-tolerant wheat varieties, and we distributed them to farmers planted on about 294,000 hectares. And production of wheat in Sudan went up from about 300,000 tons to 1.1 million tons. That's almost a threefold increase, more than a threefold increase. And so what we have seen is that when you give the farmer the right seeds and the right training and also provide them a market, they can actually boost productivity and boost production. The second example is Ethiopia. Again, in wheat. Ethiopia grows wheat on the highlands, the kind of better conditioned highland, but the country imports more than almost 2 million tons of wheat. So they're trying to expand wheat production. Again, in Ethiopia, what happened was that we gave them the same heat-tolerant drought varieties and the wheat varieties, and they were able to expand wheat production into the lower, hotter areas of Ethiopia. And today, Ethiopia has like 20,000 hectares in the lowlands. They're going to expand that to 200,000 hectares eventually. In Kenya, it was drought-tolerant maize seeds. Kenya is a country like most of the maize-growing areas where you have unpredictable, dry seasons during the growth cycle, and that can reduce yields. But science has developed varieties of maize that tolerate drought. And what we have seen is that in Kenya, we're able to work with the seed companies, 28 seed companies, to produce 8,000 tons of drought-tolerant maize seeds. And this was given to farmers. It increased their yields from 1.5 tons to 2.5 tons, even during the dry periods, dry spells that you find in a growing season. So those three examples shows you that the bank believes very strongly if you have the right partners, the right technologies, you can actually reach farmers and you can increase food production. You can make things better on the continent.
Well, before we leave you today, before we let you go, Mr. Frigane, as you discuss with stakeholders at the event today, what kind of commitment are you seeing from both the public and private sector to this going forward?
Well, I'm proud to announce that after today's meeting, 5 multilateral development banks pledged a total of $17.5 billion towards scaling up and other activities in the agricultural space on the African continent. For example, the African Development Bank pledged $1.57 billion to scaling up technologies and another $8.83 billion to also building the infrastructure backbone and also building agro-processing and other parts of agriculture. The International Food and Agriculture Fund, or IFAD, International Fund for Agricultural Development, sorry, IFAD, pledged $1.5 billion also for agricultural development. The Islamic Development Bank pledged $3.5 billion. This is all over the next 3 to 5 years. The Arab Development Bank in Africa pledged $1.5 billion, and the Gates Foundation and other donors pledged $675 million for R&D. So a total of $17.5 billion was pledged today. That actually makes me very, very happy. The political leaders, the heads of states, also made commitments, political commitments, and financial commitments to support the financial, the development partners to ensure that success will be achieved in scaling technologies all across Africa in the next 3 to 5 years.
Quite interesting. Certainly lots of funding pledged at today's event towards scaling up innovation in Africa's agriculture sector. Thank you so much for your insights on the show today, Mr. Fregene. That, of course, is Martin Fregene. He's the Director of Agriculture and Agro-Industry at the African Development Bank.